Miserable Appalachians, the rotten generation that was born and died in the same valley. Say that again. Say it slow. Miserable Appalachians, the rotten generation that was born and died in the same valley. Because that is not just a title. That is a grave marker. That is a stone pressed into the side of a mountain that never let anyone out and never let anyone forget. And the names carved into that stone belong to 3 real people who woke up every morning in the same hollow, breathed the same cold air, and carried in their own bodies the full and undeniable cost of a bloodline that had been folding back on itself for longer than any of them had been alive to understand it. There is a place in the mountains of West Virginia that does not appear on most maps. It sits at the absolute bottom of a cut in the earth called Gravel Run, a name known only to the handful of families who had, over the course of more than a century, settled into its depth and stayed there generation after generation, until staying became the only thing any of them knew how to do. The mountains close around Gravel Run like hands. The trees grow dense on every slope. The single trail that connects the hollow to the nearest road turns to mud for 8 months and freezes solid for 4, and in either condition, it is not a path that invites travel. It is a path that discourages it. It always has. The nearest town, a place called Render, West Virginia, population somewhere around 300 on a good year, sat 11 miles away on foot. 11 miles through mountain terrain, through mud or ice, past no other houses, past nothing that suggested the presence of a world beyond the trees. For most of the families who had lived in Gravel Run over the decades, those 11 miles might as well have been 1,000. They rarely made the journey. When they did, they returned quickly. Render had long memories, and the things it remembered about certain hollow families were not the kinds of things that made for comfortable visits. The Cutler family had been in Gravel Run since before anyone currently living could remember. They had arrived sometime in the 1880s, a man, a woman, children whose names had not survived in any record, and they had built a house from salvaged timber at the very bottom of the hollow beside the creek in the flattest ground available, and they had stayed. The house had been repaired and expanded and reduced and repaired again across the decades, and by 1962 it was a 2-room structure that leaned slightly to the left and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth and the particular staleness of a space that had been continuously inhabited for a very long time by people who had nowhere else to go. There was no electricity in the Cutler house in 1962. There was no running water. There was a fireplace that provided the only heat in a structure, with walls thin enough that the winter cold pressed through them like a slow, constant argument. There was a well that had been dug by hand 3 generations back and that still produced clean water, provided you checked the surface each morning in the cold months and broke through what had frozen overnight. There was a garden plot behind the house, small, aggressively tended, the soil pushed past its natural generosity by people who needed more from it than it was inclined to give. There was a woodpile that needed constant replenishment, and a woodpile that was never quite as replenished as it needed to be. This was the world of Elmer Cutler, 34 years old in 1962, born in this hollow, born in this house, delivered into the world by hands that trembled, and a woman who did not survive the delivery. His father, a man known to everyone who had ever heard of him as Old Cal, a name that invited no questions and received none, had raised Elmer and his younger sister Dora in the complete and deliberate absence of the outside world. Old Cal did not believe in schools. He did not send his children to any. He did not believe in doctors, or neighbors, or the county government, or the church 12 miles to the east, or any institution that required him to explain himself to anyone who was not already standing inside the boundary of his property. He had built his life around the principle that the less the world knew about him, the safer he was, and he had transmitted this principle to his children not through instruction, but through years of practiced, unspoken example. Old Cal died in the winter of 1957 from a chest illness that a doctor could have treated and that a doctor never saw. He died in the same room he had been born in the same bed, without ceremony, without medical care, without any official record of his passing. Elmer and Dora buried him in the field behind the house, in the cold ground, in an unmarked place. They did not mark it because he had asked them not to. They did not report it because it did not occur to them that reporting was required, or because it occurred to them, and they chose not to, and the distinction between those two possibilities had, by 1962, ceased to matter. Elmer had inherited the hollow. He had inherited the house, the garden, the well, the woodpile, and the 11 miles of mountain trail between himself and the nearest town. He had inherited a way of life built entirely on self-sufficiency and isolation, a way of life in which the outside world was not an aspiration or a resource, but a vague and somewhat threatening abstraction, something that existed beyond the tree line, and occasionally sent surveyors and welfare officers through the mud with clipboards and careful expressions. He had also inherited his body, and his body was, in the medical language that Elmer had never been given and would not have known how to use, a document, a record, a physical accounting of what happens when a bloodline stays inside itself for long enough that the recessive architecture of its genetics begins to express itself without interruption, without the dilution that comes from new blood, without anything to soften or redirect what had been quietly accumulating in the Cutler line for generations. Elmer's right arm was the first thing anyone noticed about him. It was thin, not simply lean, not simply the arm of a man who used one side more than the other, but thin in the way of something that had not fully developed, the muscle tissue minimal, the bone prominent beneath the skin, the hand at the end of it slightly curled and delicate, the fingers functional but fine in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the rest of him. His left arm was the opposite in almost every measurable respect. It was large, dense, the forearm thick with the muscle of a man who had been doing the work of 2 arms with one for his entire adult life, chopping wood, hauling water, splitting stone, managing every physical demand that the hollow placed on a person, all of it moving through that one arm, which had responded by becoming something almost architectural in its solidity. The asymmetry between them was striking at a distance and arresting up close, the thin right hanging at his side like a thing borrowed from a different body, the left holding or carrying or working at all times, the engine of his survival. His face carried its own particular signature. The nose was prominent, wide across the bridge, heavy at the tip, the tissue thick in a way that made breathing audible at rest and labored during exertion, the nostrils flared and the overall structure dominant in a way that organized everything else around it. Along the lower left side of his jaw, running from just below the ear toward the chin, there was a growth, dense and rounded, a mass of tissue that had been present since birth and had grown slowly through his childhood and adolescence into something that now occupied a significant portion of that side of his face. It was not painful. It had never been painful, but it changed the geometry of his jaw, altered the way it closed, made eating certain things awkward and speaking slightly distorted, the words coming out shaped by a mouth that had learned to work around an obstacle that most mouths do not have. Above his left eyebrow, a second, smaller growth created a raised, smooth dome that gave the upper part of his face a lopsided quality, the left side sitting fractionally higher than the right, as if something beneath the skin had decided to take up more space than was available. His eyes, by contrast, were clear and steady and dark brown and set deep beneath the brow, and they watched everything with the unwavering attention of someone for whom observation has always been the primary tool of understanding. He was not a stupid man. He had taught himself to read from the 3 books that had been in the house since before his birth, a Bible, a farmer's almanac from 1931, and a water-damaged novel of uncertain title. He understood the seasons with a precision that would have impressed a trained agronomist. He understood the mechanics of every tool he used and repaired and improvised. He understood, in the wordless and entirely unexamined way of someone who has never been given language for it, that his body was different from other bodies. He had understood this since childhood. He had simply continued living because there was nothing else available to do. Dora Cutler was 29 in 1962. She was small, compact, slightly built, her frame asymmetrical in ways that were apparent once you had seen her walk. Her left leg was the most visible difference. The tibia bowed outward from the knee in the pronounced curve that orthopedic medicine identifies as severe Blount's disease, a condition in which the growth plate of the lower leg is disrupted during development, and the bone curves dramatically rather than growing straight, pulling the knee inward and pushing the lower leg out in an arc that, without treatment, becomes permanent. Dora had never received treatment. The condition had progressed from childhood through adolescence and into adulthood without interruption, and the result was a leg that bore its weight at a significant angle, a gait that required constant negotiation with the terrain, a rolling, compensatory walk that had become so habitual and so precisely calibrated to the specific irregularities of the hollow's ground that she moved through gravel run with a fluency she could not have reproduced anywhere else. Along the right side of her neck, beginning just below the jaw and extending downward toward the collarbone, there was a soft mass, diffuse at its edges, present enough to alter the silhouette of that side of her neck when viewed from across a room. On her forehead, slightly left of center, a dome-shaped growth sat smooth and firm beneath the skin, giving her brow a sculptural asymmetry. Her teeth showed the misalignment of a jaw that had developed along irregular lines, and she had lost 2 molars on the right side to infections that had been managed with the household remedies available in the hollow and nothing more. She knew the hollow better than she knew herself. She knew which plants along the creek were edible, which were medicinal in the rough, practical sense, which would make a person violently sick. She knew the weather 2 days out by the color of the afternoon light through the tree cover. She knew the exact location and current status of every resource within a mile of the house, the berry patches, the mushroom grounds, the places where the soil was deep enough for certain roots. She managed the food, the preservation, the rationing, the 1,000 small calculations of sufficiency that kept 3 people fed and functional through every season of every year. She did this without discussion, without acknowledgement, without any framework that suggested it deserved either. She did it because it needed doing, and because she was the one who knew how. Harold Cutler was 18 years old in 1962. He had been born in 1944 in this same house, without a doctor, without records, without any official acknowledgement that he had arrived in the world. His birth was the result of the relationship between Elmer and Dora that had begun years before, a fact this account states plainly and without elaboration, not for sensation, but because to describe Harold's body without describing its origins would be to falsify the most important thing about it. Harold was not simply the product of siblings. He was the endpoint of a bloodline that had been narrowing for generations. Old Cal's parentage itself, the product of cousin relationships going back to the late 1800s. The Cutler line compressing and recompressing across decades until Harold arrived as the accumulated expression of everything that compression had built up. His body showed it comprehensively. His right arm matched Elmer's, thin, underdeveloped, the muscle minimal, the hand fine and slightly curled at his side. His left arm exceeded even Elmer's in its compensatory density, having taken on from earliest childhood the full burden of every task that required strength, the disproportion between the 2 arms in Harold even more dramatic than in his father, the left side of his body carrying a decade and a half of overcompensation in every visible fiber. His legs combined elements of Dora's Blount's disease with an additional rotational component, the knees angling inward while the lower legs curved outward, the gait requiring a complex, effortful negotiation of every step that made flat ground laborious and uneven terrain genuinely difficult. He had never run in his life. As a child, he had watched birds with a focused, sustained attention that Elmer had initially found puzzling, before understanding it as a child watching a kind of movement that was simply unavailable to him, studying it the way you study a language you will never speak. His face carried the most complex arrangement of the 3. Growths appeared in multiple locations, a dense, rounded mass along the right side of his forehead, a second beneath his left eye that pushed the surrounding tissue outward and altered the geometry of that entire cheek, a third along his chin that changed the lower profile of his face entirely. His nose shared Elmer's characteristic width and weight, amplified. His jaw showed Dora's misalignment, amplified. His speech, when he used it, which was not often, carried the sound of a mouth that had been shaped by all of these forces at once, the words coming out recognizable but textured by the particular architecture his face had built around them. He was, despite all of this, entirely and completely a person. He had a memory for the physical details of the hollow that was essentially perfect. He could have mapped every square yard of it from memory with complete accuracy. He had opinions about weather and water, and which sections of the creek ran fish best in which months. He had a sense of humor that was private and dry, and expressed itself almost entirely through a slight change in the quality of his silence. He had fears. He had preferences. He had somewhere beneath the practical, wordless, day-to-day language of hollow survival a rich and unexamined interior life that the hollow had never provided any outlet for and that no one had ever thought to ask about. He had never spoken to anyone outside of Elmer and Dora. He had never left Gravel Run. He had never seen a photograph of himself. He existed in 1962 entirely within the geography of his birth. Known to no one, documented nowhere, officially non-existent in every record that the state of West Virginia maintained. The three of them were a system. Not a family in the way the outside world would have recognized or would have been comfortable recognizing, but a functional unit, three people in a hard place who needed each other to survive and who had built, over Harold's 18 years of life, a way of living together that worked. Elmer managed the physical infrastructure. Dora managed the resources and the food. Harold did what his body allowed, which was less than either of theirs, but was given completely. They did not speak much. The hollow did not require speech. It required action, and action was what they all understood. This was their life in 1962. And in the spring of 1962, a man with a clipboard walked down the logging trail, and the life they had built began, slowly and irrevocably, to change. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. As histórias que contamos aqui são as que ninguém mais tem coragem de contar, e você não vai querer perder nenhuma delas. Paul Adkins was 26 years old and worked for a state agency, conducting land assessments of undocumented hollow settlements in West Virginia's eastern counties. He had a clipboard, a good pair of boots, and a mild professional confidence that had not yet been tested by anything that couldn't be resolved with paperwork. He found the logging trail to Gravel Run by following the creek line on a survey map that showed a trail where the satellite images showed trees, and he followed it on foot until it ended. And at its end, he found the clearing and the house and Elmer Cutler standing in front of it. He stopped walking. The stopping was involuntary. Elmer looked up from what he was doing, and the two men looked at each other across the clearing with the stillness of people who have each recognized that something significant is happening, and neither of them knows yet what it will cost. Elmer spoke first. He asked, in a voice shaped by years of speaking around the growth on his jaw, what the man wanted. Paul explained himself. The survey, the agency, the paperwork, the routine nature of the visit. Elmer listened without expression. Then he said there was nothing here worth surveying, and Paul could leave the way he came. Paul did not leave. He had been trained for resistance. He asked politely if there were others on the property. Elmer paused, and in the pause Paul heard movement from inside the house, the distinctive uneven sound of Dora's gate on the wooden floor. And Elmer said yes, there were two others, and gave their names, and Paul wrote them down, and in writing Harold Cutler's name for the first time on an official document, Paul Adkins created the first record that Harold had ever existed. Dora appeared in the doorway. She stood there without speaking, watching Paul with the same steady, measuring attention as Elmer. Paul was looking at her neck, her brow, her leg. He was looking at Elmer's arm, his jaw. He was a young man with survey training and not a medical background, and still he understood in a wordless and immediate way what he was looking at. He had read about consanguinity in a textbook once, in the dry language of population genetics. He was understanding it now in a completely different way. Harold did not appear that day. He was in the back garden working the soil, unaware that a man with a clipboard was at the front of the house writing his name down for the first time in his life. He did not know that the machinery of the outside world had just registered his existence and begun slowly to turn. Paul left that afternoon. He sat in his truck outside the county office in Render for a long time before going in. He filed his report with careful clinical language. The Cutler Hollow, 3 occupants, recommended medical evaluation, recommended welfare follow-up. He did not include the note he wrote and then removed, the one that said these people need help, this survey is not equipped to provide. He removed it because he was 26 and unsure of himself and afraid of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. He drove home to Charleston and thought about Gravel Run for the rest of the spring more than he thought about anything else. Back in the hollow, Elmer told Dora about the visitor in the economy of words that was their normal mode. Dora asked if he would come back. Elmer said he did not know. Dora said nothing more. Neither did Elmer. But they both understood, in the way of people who have spent their lives reading the weather and the water and the meaning behind what other people do not say, that something had shifted, that the edge of their world had been found, that found things do not easily become unfound. Harold heard about it the next morning. He asked what a survey was. Elmer explained it practically. The state counts things, records them, makes maps. Harold thought about this and asked if it was a problem. Elmer said he didn't know yet. For Harold, the knowledge that someone from outside now knew they existed carried a weight he could not fully separate into its parts. He had grown up with the quality of Elmer and Dora's silence about the outside world, the particular loaded silence of people who have learned that the world's attention comes with consequences. He had absorbed this the way you absorb weather, not by being told about it, but by existing inside it long enough that it becomes the texture of everything. He felt it now as something between wariness and something else, something he didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt like a step toward something he couldn't take back. Summer came. The garden struggled in a dry year. The creek ran lower than usual. Elmer's left shoulder, the shoulder of the arm that did everything, the arm that the entire hollow ran through, began to show the first signs of damage that 34 years of sole mechanical dependence had been building toward. A grinding on certain movements, a pain that arrived with cold mornings and stayed past noon. He said nothing to Dora or Harold. He adjusted, compensated, found workarounds. But Dora noticed. She always noticed. She began without announcement to redistribute the physical work of the hollow, taking on tasks she had previously left to Elmer, managing them on her bowed leg with the stubbornness of someone who has never been offered a less difficult option. Harold watched this shift happen and followed it, pressing against the edges of what his own body could manage, and doing so consistently and without complaint. The three of them were a system, and the system self-corrected, and neither the correction nor the reason for it was ever discussed directly. This was how they communicated about almost everything that mattered. In August of 1962, a county welfare officer named Margaret Hoskins made the trip to Gravel Run. She was a professional 12 years in welfare work, a genuinely decent person, who arrived with practiced warmth and institutional purpose and a pair of good shoes that went wrong in the mud almost immediately. She found all three of them this time. She introduced herself and explained her role, and began asking questions with the particular efficiency of someone who has already decided, before arriving, what the situation is. She saw Harold for the first time, and her pen paused on the notebook without her entirely meaning it to. Harold was standing slightly behind Elmer, his weight on his left side, his right arm hanging at its characteristic angle, the growths on his forehead and cheek and chin visible in the flat August light. He was watching her watch him, with a complete and unembarrassed steadiness, the eyes dark and level beneath the irregular landscape of his brow. She asked if Harold had ever seen a doctor. Elmer said no. She asked for a birth certificate. Elmer said there was not one. She asked about Harold's parentage with the careful, indirect phrasing of a professional navigating something she already suspects and does not want to ask wrongly. Elmer looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then he said Harold was his. He said Dora was his sister. The order of these two statements, Harold is mine, Dora is my sister, sat in the clearing between them for a moment before Margaret Hoskins wrote anything down. She left with a notebook full of information and a carefully neutral face. She wrote her report at her desk in Render that evening and used the word consanguinity, the clinical word, the one that put necessary distance between the writer and the weight of what was being described. She recommended medical evaluation for all three. She recommended a follow-up visit from a specialized team. The report moved up the county chain at the pace of bureaucratic machinery in rural West Virginia in 1962, which was slow but not stopped. In October, the team arrived. Margaret Hoskins, a county health nurse named Carol Blevins, a man from the state office whose name none of the Cutlers retained. They came on a dry day. Carol Blevins examined all three of them, with the careful, thorough attention of a nurse who understood the importance of being honest without being cruel. She told Elmer his shoulder had significant damage that would worsen without treatment. She told Dora that years of misaligned weight-bearing had done cumulative damage to the joint above and below the tibial curve. She examined Harold at length and said nothing during the examination, which was its own kind of communication. Afterward, the team gathered by their vehicle and spoke quietly. Then Margaret Hoskins came back and explained the recommendations: medical treatment, documentation for Harold, an assessment of what assistance was available. Elmer asked if it was voluntary. She said yes for now. He said he needed time to think. She left her card. They watched the team walk back down the logging trail and disappear into the trees. Dora said they would come back whether Elmer decided anything or not. Elmer said he knew. Harold said nothing. He was looking at the place in the trees where the team had disappeared, at the gap, at the thin strip of sky above the trail. He was looking at it the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand. Still and focused and not looking away, not looking. That fall brought the kind of wet, persistent rain that the Appalachian autumn specializes in. Not dramatic, not sudden, just unceasing, saturating the ground until the clearing around the house became soft and clinging, and the logging trail ran like a shallow stream. The three of them spent more time inside, more time in the two rooms, more time in the specific, layered silence of people who share a small space and a large number of things that have never been said. It was during one of those rain-grey evenings, while the fire worked at keeping the cold out, and Elmer's shoulder was clearly bothering him more than he would acknowledge, that Harold asked the question he had been carrying for as long as he could remember. He asked Elmer why his body was the way it was. Elmer was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The rain worked on the roof. From the other room, the sound of Dora's movement had stopped, which meant she was listening. Elmer did not answer directly. He answered the way he answered most hard questions, from the side, in pieces, approaching the truth at an angle without ever arriving at its center. He said that some things run in families. He said the Cutlers had always been this way, some of them. He said old Cal had been this way in certain respects, and old Cal's father before him. He said it was the blood, using those words plainly, the way you would say it's the weather. It's the blood. Harold asked what that meant. Elmer said that the Cutlers had stayed in this valley and stayed among themselves, and that over a long enough time that leaves marks. He said it without apology and without elaboration. He said it the way you say something that is simply true, a fact about the physical world, the way water always finds the lowest ground. Harold sat with this for a long time. He looked at his thin right arm. He looked at his left arm, so much larger. He thought about Dora's leg, the growth on her neck. He thought about his own face in the surface of the well water in the mornings, the way he had looked at it since he was old enough to notice, and the way he had never had any language for what he saw. He thought about Elmer's jaw and his own jaw, and the way those two things were the same and different at once. He asked if it would have been different. If old Cal had left, gone somewhere else, been around other people. If the Cutlers had not stayed in this valley for as long as they had. Elmer said yes, without hesitation, yes, it would have been different. Harold nodded once and said nothing more. The fire crackled. The rain came down. That was the end of the conversation. But something had moved slightly in the space where those words had been said, and once something moves, it does not fully return to where it was. Elmer's shoulder worsened through November. The compensatory habits of a lifetime had been quietly building damage in every surrounding structure. The rotator cuff, the joint itself, the muscles supporting it, and the accumulated bill was coming due. He could still use the arm. He could not use it the way he had. The gap between what needed to be done and what he could physically do was widening by the week, and the hollow, which had always been a system calibrated to the precise capabilities of 3 specific people, was beginning to register the change. Harold watched his father's arm with an anxiety he could not name. He understood, without needing anyone to explain it, that Elmer's left arm was the physical center around which their survival organized itself. The firewood, the water, the repairs, every load that needed lifting and every blow that needed landing, all of it moved through that arm, and the arm was failing. He began doing more, pressing further against the limits of what his legs could manage, what his own left arm could carry, working at the edges of his capacity with the careful, deliberate stubbornness of someone who understands exactly what is at stake and has decided to give everything available rather than watch the system fail. Dora watched both of them, managing more than she said and saying less than she felt, her bowed leg carrying its extra share with the particular endurance of someone whose entire life has been built on finding a way forward despite the angle of the ground. In November, Carol Blevins returned for the second time, this time with a medical kit and practical supplies and the honest, quiet manner of someone who is genuinely trying to help within the limits of what is available. She brought aspirin in quantities that were inadequate for what she was looking at, and that were still more than the hollow had previously contained. She examined Elmer's shoulder and told him plainly that there was damage there that was not going to resolve on its own, and that required intervention she could not provide in this hollow. She said it gently and meant it seriously. Elmer thanked her and said he would think about it. Carol Blevins left knowing he would not think about it in any direction that led to action, and she was correct, and the winter arrived, and Elmer managed his shoulder the way he managed everything, by finding the workaround and not complaining about the cost of finding it. December brought the cold in earnest. The woodpile was not where it needed to be, and all three of them knew it, and none of them said so, and all three of them worked toward it every day that the weather allowed, from first light until the light failed. Harold's legs were worse in the cold, the joints stiff and painful on the cold mornings, the walk from the house to the woodpile requiring a deliberate, grinding effort on the first trips of the day that eased only slightly as the body warmed. He made the trips anyway. He made them as many times as the day allowed. One evening in late November, sitting by the fire after Elmer had gone to sleep, Dora said to Harold, without looking up from what she was doing, in the flat, sideways manner of the Cutler family's most significant communications, that thinking about the outside did not mean anything wrong about being here. Harold looked at her. He asked how she knew what he was thinking about. She said she had been 18 once too. He asked after a moment if she had ever wanted to leave. She was quiet long enough that the fire shifted and settled before she answered. She said yes. She said she had wanted to leave when she was his age, and then there had been him. And then wanting to leave had become something different, not gone but changed. The way wanting changes when the thing you can't leave behind is also the thing you'd want to take with you. Harold said nothing. He reached across and put his left hand over hers for a moment, then took it away. They sat by the fire until the fire needed feeding, and the wind worked at the edges of the house. And from the other room, Elmer's breathing was slow and even, and the valley held them the way it always had, completely, without comment, without asking if they wanted to be held. January came with ice. The ground froze hard. The well required serious braking each morning, the ice thick enough on the surface that the work left Harold's left arm aching by the time the bucket finally went down. The path from the house to the woodpile, worn smooth by a season of daily use, became treacherous in the cold. A surface that looked like ground and acted like glass, that grabbed and released without warning. On a morning in the second week of January, Elmer fell. It was not dramatic. It was exactly the kind of fall that happens when a body has been compensating for long enough, when the compensations themselves give out. He was carrying water from the well, a task Harold had been managing, but that Elmer had insisted on reclaiming because Harold's legs had been particularly bad in the recent cold, and the well path was dangerous. The bucket was in his left hand. His boot found the wrong angle on the frozen path. Without the right arm to manage the impact, without the instinctive weight-bearing catch of a body built for bilateral response, he went down on his left side, the bucket going one way, Elmer going the other. He landed on the shoulder. The sound he made was short and involuntary, the kind that comes from a body before the mind can stop it. Harold and Dora came out of the house at the same moment, their respective gaits urgent and ungainly on the frozen ground. They found Elmer sitting up in the mud beside the well, his face the color of the winter sky, his left arm held against his chest in the unmistakable posture of something seriously damaged. Harold looked at his father's arm. He looked at his face. He said, in the flat and direct manner of a person who has made a decision, that they needed to go to town. Elmer said no. Harold said it a second time, not louder, but heavier. Different in quality from the way he usually spoke, steadier, more final, like something that had been decided before the words arrived. He said they needed to go to town, and they needed to go now, and he needed Dora to help him figure out how. Elmer looked at Harold for a long moment. He was in pain. The arm was bad. The face of his son, carrying his own features rearranged, the growths, the asymmetry, all of it, was looking at him with something he had not seen there before. Not defiance, not desperation, something simpler and harder than either. Decision. Elmer said, "Okay." They left that morning. It was the first time Harold had ever walked the 11 miles to Render. He walked it in the January cold with Dora on his left side and Elmer between them. The logging trail frozen hard under their feet, the trees bare and grey on both sides, the sky a flat white above the narrow gap between the tree line. Harold's legs managed the flat stretches with their laboured, deliberate gait, the knees and tibias negotiating each footfall. Where the terrain changed, Dora was there. Her bowed leg finding the path of least resistance the way it always did, the two of them moving through the winter landscape like something the mountain had grown itself, irregular and specific and precisely calibrated to this particular ground. Render was small. By any measure, it was a modest, simple town, 200 and some people, a main street, a county office, a medical practice, a few storefronts that opened most days. But to Harold it was completely and overwhelmingly other, not because of its size, because it was not the Hollow, because the houses here sat in the landscape differently, because the streets had been put there deliberately, because the shapes of things followed human logic rather than the logic of rock and water, because there were people on the street, and they looked, not everyone, not for long, but they looked the way people look at something outside their experience of normal, the brief, involuntary focus of eyes that have encountered something unexpected and are processing it before the social training that teaches you not to stare kicks in and moves them along. Harold kept his eyes forward and his pace steady, and he brought his father through the door of the county medical office on Render's main street, and he stood in the waiting room with Dora, and he held every one of those glances inside him without letting any of them show on his face. Carol Blevins was there. She recognized the shape of them as they came through the door and came to the waiting room and sat with Harold and Dora while Elmer was seen to. She asked Harold, in the quiet and direct way that was her manner, how he was doing with being here. He said it was loud. She nodded. She asked if he had thought about the things discussed in October, the records, the evaluation, the assistance. Harold said he had. She asked what he thought. He was quiet for a long time. Dora was beside him, not offering anything, leaving the space open for whatever Harold was going to do with it. The waiting room was warm in the way of buildings with central heating, a warmth Harold had never experienced before. Not the radiant, localized heat of a fireplace, but a general, ambient, everywhere warmth that came from no visible source. He said that he had never had his name on paper. He said he was 18 years old and he had never had his name on paper. He said the Hollow was home and he was not saying it was not, but he was 18 years old and he had never had his name on paper, and that seemed like something. He was not sure what kind of something, but something. Carol Blevins said yes. She said it was something. Dr. Horace Webb had been practicing in Render for 20 years. He set Elmer's arm, assessed the shoulder damage with the thorough attention of a man who has seen a great deal and has learned not to express his reactions in his face, and told Elmer plainly that the shoulder required surgery that Render could not provide, that it needed to happen in Charleston, and that without it Elmer was looking at permanent and significant loss of function in his left arm. The left arm, the arm the Hollow ran through. The arm that had been the mechanical center of their survival for 34 years. Elmer asked how they would get to Charleston. Horace Webb said the county could arrange it. Elmer said he was not leaving without his family. Webb said the county could accommodate all three. And so it was decided in a waiting room in a small medical office in Render, West Virginia, on a cold day in January 1963, that the Cutler family of Gravel Run was going to leave the Hollow. Leave a comment right now. Type "I hear them" if you feel the weight of this story, the way the mountains felt the weight of these three people who never asked for anything except to survive. They drove to Charleston in a county van, driven by Margaret Hoskins, who spent the 3-hour drive watching the three of them in her rearview mirror more than she watched the road. The landscape changed gradually around them, the mountains narrowing and then opening, the road widening, the scattered settlements becoming more frequent and then continuous until the city assembled itself around them in a way that Harold could not have predicted or imagined. He pressed his face briefly toward the window without meaning to. Then he sat back and watched without pressing. Charleston was not a large city by any national standard. In 1963, it was a regional center of modest size with a hospital, a government district, and the ordinary infrastructure of a city that had been built for people moving through it with ease. To Harold, it was something his mind could not immediately organize. Too many buildings, too many sounds layering over each other without resolution, too many people moving through streets with the unconscious ease of those who have never had to think about being seen. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and warm air. The floors were smooth, a smoothness Harold's legs registered as different from any surface he had walked on, requiring a slight recalibration of every step. A social worker named Thomas came to the waiting room while Elmer was in surgery and sat with Harold and Dora and spoke to them about documentation, about the process of establishing official records for people who had not previously had them. He produced a form. He set it on the table between them and explained what each field required. Harold looked at the form for a moment, then he picked up the pen, in his left hand, the strong hand, the hand that had always done everything, and he wrote his name. Harold Cutler. The letters were uneven, self-taught, unpracticed on any surface where mistakes couldn't be erased or paper wasted, but they were his and they were legible, and they stayed on the form in the way that things written on official forms stay, permanently, in a file, in a system that would hold them for as long as systems hold things. He looked at the name for a moment. Then he slid the form across the table to Thomas. It was the first time his name had been committed to any record by his own hand. It was the first time he had formally existed, in the legal and documentary sense, in the world outside Gravel Run. He was 18 years old. His name was Harold Cutler. He had been born in 1944 in a hollow in West Virginia, and from this moment forward there was a piece of paper that said so. Elmer's surgery was successful. The shoulder was repaired, not restored. Not returned to what it had been before decades of sole-arm dependence had worn it down, but stabilized, the acute damage addressed, the trajectory interrupted. He would need rehabilitation. He would need to modify certain movements permanently. He received this information with the plain, workmanlike acceptance of someone for whom all information is simply information to be worked with. They stayed in Charleston for 4 days. The county arranged a motel. 4 days in which Harold saw more of the world than he had seen in the accumulated 18 years of his life before this. He walked, not far, his legs limiting the radius, but he walked with Dora beside him through the streets near the hospital, looking at the city the way he looked at the hollow in the mornings, with the steady, comprehensive attention of someone cataloguing a place he needs to understand. People looked at him on the street. Some of them looked longer than others. A child stared at him with the open, unfiltered directness of someone too young for the social training that teaches adults to redirect their gaze, and the child's mother took the child's hand and moved them along, and Harold watched them go. He did not feel anger. He noticed this and examined it, and found that what was actually there was something closer to understanding. A flat, clear recognition that the world had been built for bodies different from his, that this fact was neither accusation nor apology, that it simply was the way most facts about the physical world simply are. He had been looking at his own body his entire life, and reaching the same conclusion about himself that the world reached about him from a distance, and the convergence of those two perspectives felt, if anything, like a kind of honesty. On the third evening, Dora and Harold sat together in the motel room while Elmer slept, the television on with the sound low. Neither of them had seen a television before, and neither of them acknowledged the strangeness of this. They simply watched it. And Dora said, looking at the screen, that she thought Harold should have